Hi, it's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and welcome to the super long form version of me making my Bridgerton treat box. There's separate tutorials within this entire video, so feel free to jump through those, but at the very end of the video, there is packaging as well as pricing. Enjoy! If you've never had a meringue cookie before, they're very light and airy and made with basically two simple ingredients plus whatever flavorings you want to put in there. Today, we're going to be using Earl Grey as I mentioned, and this really helps to tone down the sweetness because I'm not going to lie to you, meringue cookies are quite sweet. If you don't have a lot of hands-on preparation time, this is a great cookie to make because it's super quick. However, I will say it does not get completed in a very timely manner as it takes around 2 to 2.5 hours to fully dry out these cookies. So make sure that you have enough time in your oven before starting. I'm starting off by separating my fresh eggs. Don't use the egg whites in a carton. I just find it doesn't work as well. You will need around 4 egg whites for this recipe. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to let those egg whites just sit out in room temperature for a little bit. It works best when they're not super cold. I'm using a good quality Earl Grey, not just the stuff in those packages that you get from the grocery store. I like to use the loose leaf tea because I find it's much stronger, and any flavoring that you're going to be using in a meringue does tend to show up in the cookie a lot since it doesn't have a lot of other ingredients to hide behind. I have my 4 egg whites or 110 grams worth of egg whites in my KitchenAid stand mixer, and then I also have 300 grams of granulated sugar and about 82 grams of water. I pulverized the tea because I wanted to make sure that everything was still going to be pipeable, and this honestly makes for a better crunch and bite. And I'm also putting in a little bit of food coloring. Now, I did a whole array of food colors. Honestly, you could just use one and it'll be just fine. But I wanted to get that Bridgerton blue, which as we know is a little bit of a cooler tone. You're going to start whipping the egg whites when that sugar and water get to about 240 degrees Fahrenheit. After it gets to 244 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to start pouring this liquid very, very slowly into the whipping egg whites. And make sure that you're not whipping too high. If you do, sometimes that sugar ends up going everywhere and going on the sides of your bowl instead of directly into the egg whites, which is what you want. Whip this on high for about 3 minutes and you should get these glossy, stiff peaks. You don't want dry, stiff peaks because then you're not going to get this piped very nicely. I'm using a macaron template that I have, but you could skip the template altogether and just eyeball it. And with something like this, you're probably going to be fine. Get a disposable piping bag. Sometimes people do like to use the reusable ones, but I say just use the disposable. It is way easier and honestly more food safe. I just find I could never get that eggy smell out of the ones that are reusable. And make sure you fold down the lip of that piping bag quite a bit when you're filling. This is a rookie mistake. Usually what happens is the filling is too high and then it ends up seeping out everywhere. So make sure that you have a nice good twist on the top. When I look at a lot of the Bridgerton desserts that are in those amazing wedding scenes and party scenes where they just have desserts everywhere, they always seem to have use of this French tip. Everything looks very grand, so I wanted to make sure that these meringue cookies also looked very grand and indulgent. And if you've never had a meringue cookie, biting into one of these is the most satisfying thing ever, and it just feels better when it's bigger for some reason. There used to be this bakery right beside my university that sold really long meringue cookies like this. I think they were a little bit thinner, but I remember just loving biting into it. The key to getting these nice and even is making sure that you have even pressure the whole way through and really using that swirling motion. And I should have also mentioned, use a sill pat for this. This way, if you mess up, you can just scrape it off and you're not going to have any residue. With parchment paper, you can't get it as clean, and it also tends to not bake as evenly and thoroughly. So sill pats are definitely the way to go. I'm finishing off these meringue cookies with just another sprinkle of that loose leaf Earl Grey. I wanted to try out one other little shape, so I decided to do a round version, and then I added on some of these leftover royal icing flowers that I had. I put these in the oven at 190 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2.5 hours. If your oven is really powerful, I suggest that you turn it down to about 185 to avoid any cracking whatsoever. The meringue cookies can be stored up to 3 weeks, and this is one of those treats that you can make first so that you can work on all of the other things since they keep so well. I highly recommend storing them in an airtight container with a little bit of cornstarch on the bottom and then place some paper towels on top so it absorbs any potential moisture that might get in there. Moving along to the flour macarons, these are also great to make in advance because they can actually stay in your freezer for up to 3 months. Now, I usually consume them within 1 month, but 3 months and they are still totally fine as long as you keep them in an airtight container. You might not have known that you can actually make textured macarons, but they're actually a lot simpler than making traditional flat macarons. The first thing you're going to want to do is pick a reliable macaron recipe. So if you have a tried and true that you absolutely love, chances are it's going to work because it's all in the process of how we combine the wet, in this case the egg whites and the sugar, so the meringue, and the dry ingredients, in this case the almond flour and icing sugar. And if you're wanting to make multiple colors in one batch, you are going to have to measure everything out like I'm doing individually. You can't mix the batter and then add the colorant in. You need to do it during this process here. I'm making flowers and I know that I'm going to be airbrushing them, so I want to make sure I'm going really, really light with my macaron colorant. You want to make sure that you're just using standard food gel colorant, or you can also use powdered, but don't use anything oil-based like for chocolate. One of the places where I find that food gel colorant doesn't go a long way is specifically in macaron batter. I feel like you have to add a lot if you want a really, really deep, rich color. In this instance, I want it to be rather pale, so I only added 1 or 2 drops. I'm showing this whole portion in real time, and it's because this is where the magic happens for your textured macaron. Notice I'm not beating out the air like you would with a traditional macaron. I'm just waiting until everything is pretty much fully incorporated. I have a few streaks of colorant here and there, but it's better to undermix it just a little bit than to overmix it. You see how it's sticking to the spatula? I want to mix the rest of my colors, but I do need to be speedy, so I do hurriedly try to do the rest and cover it with plastic wrap so it doesn't form a skin. If you're just starting out with textured macarons, then using a 1M tip to create this rosette is the best place to start because it's super easy. If you've piped cupcakes before, you can definitely pipe this. I start from the center and then I work my way around. Try not to let that peak too much when you end off your rosette. The reason is because that part will get burnt in the oven if you let it peak up too much. This is supposed to be a pansy, but it doesn't look as pansy-like as it could. Definitely reference a picture as you're looking at this. I do think it looks like a beautiful flower still, but it doesn't look as pansy-like as it could, and that is because my petals are a little bit too even. So if you do want to make sure that you have a really beautiful pansy, look at a picture and make those petals just a little bit wider on the bottom portion. Also, to make these thin petals, which is very different than the rosette, you want to make sure you hold that piping tip nice and flat. Notice how flat I'm actually holding this. I also should mention that I'm using a Silpat for all of my macarons today. This is going to make it super easy to pipe on, and it also makes the macarons more easily removable. Parchment also doesn't bake as evenly. I'm emptying out the rest of my piping bag because I need to make the little round circles to go underneath. You could match flower to flower, but I find this a lot more difficult, especially since I'm not using a stencil for the flowers. So instead, I'm going to go with a round macaron on the bottom. I don't recommend what I'm doing here, which is using the exact same mat for those round macarons. You should really do it on a separate mat so that you can bang it out, because I do end up with air bubbles, which is why you see me banging the pans in most of my macaron videos, which helps make sure that there are no air bubbles in there. Making a different type of flower here, and honestly, I probably could have kept the exact same tip to create this flower, but I decided to do something a little different. Play around with it. Put your tips in different directions. If you're really good at piping buttercream flowers, you can pretty much use any of those ideas. And don't worry, you are going to get feet out of your macarons. I learned that pretty much to get feet, all you need to do is to let that macaron batter rest. And that's it. If you let any macaron batter rest, even if you've made it not really that correctly, I find it still develops feet. It's all about that rest time. By the way, feet on a macaron is that little bubbly bit underneath, and that's what creates that really yummy texture that macarons have. I know I showed you not too long ago how to make these circles, but you will need to mix that macaron batter again, get it a little bit looser, but not too loose because you don't want it spreading everywhere. And yes, of course, you'll always have to do that process second because, of course, you can't thicken up macaron batter once it becomes loose. One last textured macaron idea here. I am making a leaf. Notice for all of my flowers and my leaves, I'm utilizing my circular pattern underneath just to give me a bit of a guide. I don't like having to print out multiple different shapes. I like to eyeball things, but I do want to make sure that things are going to fit together. So I use circles as a guide. If you guys are more sticklers and you want to use pictures, go ahead and print those out. You can make them on Canva really easily, or there's a lot of places that also offer free PDF files, or you can pay like $1 to use some of the fancier ones. I always let my macarons rest for at least an hour. And notice here how as we go down the line, it gets less and less opaque. We're looking for opaque. Once it turns opaque, you can put it in the oven. And here they are all baked. I bake them at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for about 17 minutes. I really turned down my temperature for these because they're a little bit peaked. I don't want any of them browning, so they need lower and slower. If you don't want to overcomplicate things, you could end it there and then skip to the filling part. I'm going to be using my airbrush here. The Cookie Countess sent me this airbrush a little while ago. I absolutely love it. It is one of my favorite airbrush systems that I've used. It never clogs, which is what I'm looking for. I use a really, really light hand when I'm airbrushing macarons, and always make sure to test out your airbrush on a separate piece of paper before actually beginning on your product, because airbrush colors can look very different from the outside of the bottle. For all of my designs that I used airbrushing on, I really aimed for the center or the outer edges and make sure not to oversaturate. This should be dry within minutes. Generate Cakes sent me this luster dust. It is my new favorite gold luster dust. Not a sponsored video, but seriously, if you like the way that these turn out, definitely go and check out Generate Cakes. I added a little bit of vodka, but you can use lemon extract if you don't want to use any alcohol, just to brush on in the center. You could also dry brush this on as well, but I just find the gold really comes shining through when you add a little bit of vodka or the extract. For the roses, I'm still sticking to the center, and then I'm aiming for those ridges that are popped up just to give it that little bit of extra glam. I couldn't decide what to do with the leaves. I did add on a little bit of green airbrushing here, but I couldn't decide if I wanted them splattered with gold or not. I think they would have looked great either way. Moving on to the fillings, making a really easy fruit compote. I use frozen raspberries, and then I'm also making a chocolate ganache as well. For the ganache, I am going to be using a buttercream dam, so I just went with a 2-to-1 ratio, with the chocolate being the higher ratio. And honestly, for the fruit compote, I didn't really do too much. I just added that sugar in, added the frozen raspberries, a squeeze of lemon juice, and then I reduced it down. That pretty much is what a compote is. And then I'm using Italian meringue buttercream. There are many different ways to fill macarons. Because of the shapes of these macarons, I'm going to explain why I go with which decisions I go with. For my yellow flowers, I really wanted the side to look very beautiful because you are going to see some of this piping peek out a little bit. So I decided to go with kind of like dots on the edge because when you close up the macaron, it really looks like this beautiful beaded border from the outside. Really important that when you're piping this, you peek up those dots just a little bit to create a dam. You really don't have too much space, so you don't want that buttercream to be too thick all the way around, or else you're not going to get much ganache in the center. Before I closed these up, it really reminded me of a sunflower. For my rose macarons, I'm going to go with something a little bit different because the rose itself is already very intricate. I'm just going to go with a band all the way around, and I do 2 swoops. When I was taught how to fill macarons, it was always just the one swoop around, but I really, really want to pack in that filling. And also, these rose macarons are quite puffy in comparison to a traditional macaron, which means that the ratio of buttercream to macaron won't be so off. And I filled the roses with a little bit of that raspberry compote. In hindsight, I should have made these flowers just a little bit wider, but because I didn't, I knew for sure that the buttercream was going to peek out and possibly peek out the top, which means that I needed to make it really nice and thick underneath so it didn't look like the buttercream was just spilling out everywhere, if you know what I mean. I filled these with the raspberry compote, and then I gently placed those on top. When you place it on top, though, you do want to make sure that you're making contact with all sides of the macaron, especially if you have a thicker buttercream. If you don't press it down just a little bit, you're going to end up with gaps. These green ones are going to get rolled in score bits, so I really wasn't too picky with how I filled these up. I just needed to make sure that it was thick enough that it was going to be able to hold onto the score bits because they're a little bit thicker, so if I made it too thin, then no score bits would actually be able to attach. And I don't want any of that buttercream leaking out either. I know we talked about freezer storage at the beginning of this tutorial, but do make sure that you store it in a place where you're not having to move it constantly because these are a little bit more delicate. Someone asked me on Instagram if these are hollow in the center. They're not hollow, but they do have a little bit more of a delicate shell. I just find it's a little bit drier, a little bit more delicate because of that folding process. So do be careful with where you store it in your freezer. I accidentally slammed my drawer shut and it did break a couple. Moving along to the sugar cookies, I find that these do well for about a week iced and left out in room temperature. So if you want to make it more in advance, you can make the dough in advance. You can also bake all of the cookies and freeze those for up to 3 months in advance, but do save the decorating for the last week. To start off, I am going to be decorating all of my cookies with royal icing. I am going to be using pipe and flood consistency first, and basically my recipe is 1 cup of icing sugar to 1 tablespoon of meringue powder, and then as much water as needed. And I like to set my oven to 175 degrees Fahrenheit while that's whipping up so that I can get it preheated for when I need to dehydrate the icing. If you want to know specific details on how to get that pipe and flood consistency, you can check out this video in the right-hand corner. I am decorating a very large cookie. I know it doesn't really look that large on camera, but it is a very large cookie. It is taking up almost half of my baking tray. It's actually supposed to be one of those pull-apart cookies that gets put back together like a puzzle piece, but I find that every time I bake it, it just doesn't bake super well, and then things go wonky, and it's hard to fit those pieces back together. So I just decided to leave it as one massive cookie. When you're making something that has a lot of detail like this, it's important to make sure that you're icing in the correct order. So notice I'm not doing all of the yellow parts all at once. I want to make sure that there's some differentiation, but I don't want to have to outline it again. So to get that puffy royal icing look, I'm just doing it in sections first, and you're going to see me fill in the rest of the sections later. While that is drying up a little bit, I'm going to base ice this. And I actually used this cookie cutter for something completely different. It's actually supposed to be a Be Mine cookie cutter for Valentine's Day, but I don't like the idea of purchasing a cutter and only being able to use it for one thing. With words, it can be a little bit tricky because obviously it's made for that specific word, but I really try my hardest to make this for other words later on, and you will see that. These bees are actually from the hive cutter that you just saw, but I only took the bee portion. Now for this, I'm going to make sure to do the wings first so that the body lays over top of it quite nicely. You can do it the other way too, and I do it that way sometimes, but I really wanted the bee body to be on top of the wings. I placed all of that in the oven at about 175 degrees Fahrenheit. You might have to go lower for your oven. Make sure that it is almost the lowest temperature that your oven will go. Otherwise, you will have your icing explode on your cookies. Also, make sure not to put your cookies in the oven while the oven is still preheating. Make sure it's fully preheated and then place them in. My icing consistency could have been a bit looser for this yellow. I did make it a little bit thick, which is why you see the first parts that I did earlier have that little ripply look on them because it wasn't as thin as it could have been, and then I thinned it out once I realized it was a little bit thick. In this instance, it's not going to be a big deal because I know I'm going to be putting a lot of airbrushing and a lot of flowers on here, but if you did want a perfectly smooth cookie, you would have to scrape and then redo to make sure that that icing consistency is correct. Layers are super important in sugar cookie decorating, so again, I let that first layer of wing dry so that I could place the other ones underneath. Now, here's where I make a lot of errors. I'm just showing you this because this is what I originally wanted. I originally was going to do a ton of script and super long quotes from the Bridgerton show. I decided against it because it just didn't look like it actually matched the cookie whatsoever. So I decided to go for a much shorter quote and something that just made more sense. I'm doing this free-handed, and I also made sure to thicken up my royal icing consistency significantly. If you don't thicken it up with icing sugar or meringue powder, or a combination of both, then it will not pipe like this. So make sure whatever fine detail work you're going to be doing, you use thickened royal icing. And notice I am using a piping tip as well. I like tipless bags. It's actually way better than this, but if you don't have tipless bags, go ahead and use a coupler with a metal piping tip in a number 2. I used to always wonder why people put that plastic part in known as a coupler. It really just helps in terms of making that piping bag stronger. I find when you just have the metal tip, it's more susceptible to bursting, especially if you're using a really, really strong consistency. And B, if you do end up getting a clog, you can easily release that clog by undoing the coupler. Whereas if you just have that metal tip in there, you kind of have to get rid of the entire piping bag. After everything is fully dried, I'm just using black food gel colorant from Chef Master and mixing it with a little bit of vodka. You can also mix it with a little bit of lemon extract if you don't want to use any alcohol. And then I'm brushing it on. Now, making these little black lines is very risky. You only get one shot, so you do have to have a very steady hand when you're doing that. Then using that thickened royal icing, I'm just drawing on some of the details of the wings on the bees. This next segment where I'm making these royal icing flowers isn't super clear. I have a lot of tutorials on flower piping in general, so if you want to go and check one of those out so you can get a better and clearer understanding, I highly suggest you do that. The reason it's not very clear when I'm doing it here is because I'm doing it on this giant tray and there's a lot of flipping, but I did use even more thickened up royal icing than what I originally used for all of the line detail work. Now, there's a very specific reason why I chose to make a Bridgerton-themed treat box. The reason being, A, Bridgerton's new season is coming out in May, so I thought this is a great time to put it out there. But B, I also understand that maybe not a lot of people watch Bridgerton, so a lot of the things that I'm making are still very just spring-esque, and you can use them for your treat box ideas that are totally not anything to do with Bridgerton. But bees hold a very big significance in the show. By the way, for this gold, I am using my favorite Jenna Rae Cakes luster dust mixed with a little bit of vodka to paint that on. Once those royal icing flowers were fully dried, which did take a little while in the oven at 175 degrees Fahrenheit, I finally got to do the fun part, which is the airbrushing part, and I'm really just aiming for the center of all of these flowers. Whenever you're making a treat box, it's not just about the colors of the individual items. You want to make sure that all of the colors mesh well, and you've chosen a specific color palette if that's what you're going for. So I included a lot of sunny colors like yellow because a character named Penelope wears a lot of yellow throughout the series. For the beehive, I made sure to really put the color in those indents and not really anywhere else, a little bit on the outside of that hive. I added some of these lines for a little bit of extra decor, again going in with my number 2 and using that thickened royal icing. You don't want to use the super thick stuff like what I used for the flowers because it will be incredibly difficult to pipe through a number 2. So definitely go with something a little bit looser. If you ever thicken up your royal icing a little bit too much, just add some water to thin it out, and always make sure to re-whip your royal icing or else things will not be incorporated properly. Adding on the finishing touches with these flowers, and I do suggest you don't place this on directly when the yellow is wet, even if these flowers were ready, because then it really sinks into everything and it's hard to add in all of that airbrushing. Dehydrating the cookies will make sure that the surface is fairly dry, but it does not make your cookies stackable. I recommend waiting overnight and letting them dry completely through and through, then packaging them and sealing them up to maintain that moisture. Moving along to the cupcakes, this is something that I would put near the end of the finalization of my treat box just so that they remain nice and fresh. If you are in a pinch, you can definitely freeze your cupcakes for a couple of weeks. I personally find any longer than that, and I do start to notice a difference. And always make sure to ice it fresh. I originally wanted to make madeleines for my treat box because that is very Bridgerton, but I decided to go with something a little bit more robust. So that's why I went with the cupcakes, and I infused them with orange instead because my madeleines have this really great punch of orange zest. So I decided to go with a little bit of a denser cupcake than I normally do and add in that orange citrus note. And let me tell you, the house was smelling so, so good. I will put the recipe down in the description box below. It is not my recipe at all, but it is fantastic. I will say that. The Greek yogurt really does wonders for this recipe and adds a lot of stability. The one little tip I will give you is for bake time, I used about 20 minutes in my oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a little bit more of a crumbly cake with a very tight crumb, so just give it a little less time in the oven than you normally would with a traditional cupcake. I'm using Italian meringue buttercream, which I personally like the best when I'm piping flowers. You can also use American buttercream. You just have to make sure that whatever buttercream you're using has a fairly high butter content. It helps keep things really nice and firm, and you just get a little bit more of a glossier texture. I'm using the exact same petal tip for this entire tutorial. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making small little rainbow arcs. The more intricate you want that rose to look, the tighter together you make those. I want this to be more of an open rose, so I'm going the opposite direction this time and swooping those petals out. The biggest thing when you're piping flowers is to make sure that everything is connected. The worst thing is to have gapping in your flowers because then obviously it doesn't look like a real rose or flower. To get this pink color that's coming through little by little, all I do is I take my piping bag and I put a bunch of food coloring in there, and then I kind of squeeze it around the bag empty. Then I place my white buttercream in. This just gives it a more natural look because it comes out of the piping bag little by little and it gives an ombre effect. I gotta say, I do miss when ombre was really, really in for cakes. I just think that looked so beautiful. The more closed you want the flower to look, aim that piping bag angled in directly towards the center. So here, notice all of the petals are staying closed. And then if you want to open it up a little bit more as you get around, you just hold that piping bag up and down so that it's not actually flaring those petals out, but it's just staying nice and tall. This is always good if you have standard size boxes at your bakery or you're using packaging that doesn't have a whole lot of area around the top of the cupcake, like in a clamshell cupcake box. Then you want to make sure that you use that design so it stays nice and tall and the icing doesn't go everywhere. If you're interested in seeing how I made those bee sugar cookies, then definitely go and check out this tutorial in the right-hand corner. For this final rose, I'm doing the exact same thing that I just did on the previous one, but I am shaking that piping tip a little bit back and forth so it creates a little bit of a wavy edge. These cupcakes do really well if you store them in the fridge for about 30 minutes before packaging so nothing gets wrecked. Now we're moving on to the cake pops, which obviously you can make well in advance. The cake pops undipped last a really long time, about 3 months in the freezer with no difference whatsoever. Just make sure that you thaw them out before dipping because of course we don't want that chocolate to start cracking. Now the reason I put them at the end though is because you're probably going to be making the cupcakes and you're going to be making the cake in big batches, so this is when you would have cake. Originally, I wanted to make this really adorable vintage piped cake, but I left it for too long, things got away from me, so it went a little bit dry. But in fact, this super dry texture makes for a very, very moist cake pop. Use your cake scraps for this or cake that you've left out just a little bit too long, but it's still consumable. Or you could even use a box cake mix if you are going to be making this from scratch. You really don't need a high quality cake. I made some strawberry compote just using some frozen strawberries, covering it with a little bit of granulated sugar, cook it down until it gets that nice jammy texture, and then mix it all together. And because this is such a dry cake, I could add in a lot of the compote, so it had a big, big strawberry punch. And it also really looks like ground beef, so I feel like if I ever had to make a ground beef cake, I would definitely use this because it really did look like I was just rolling some meatballs. The place where most people mess up cake pops is right here. Getting this texture correct for the ball itself is so important. You want to have enough moisture in there so that it comes together, but you don't want it to be too moist so it starts falling apart. So when you are adding in that compote, or if you don't want to be fancy with compote, use just regular jam. You just want to make sure you add in a little bit at a time. Place your cake pops on some sort of tray because you are going to want to put this in your freezer, or better yet, your fridge if you have more time. The reason I say that a fridge is better than a freezer is because sometimes it can get too cold in the freezer and then it can cause your chocolate to crack. Once you take your meatballs, cake pops, out of the fridge, then you're going to want to melt down some chocolate. I am using candy melts today, but if you prefer the taste of white chocolate, definitely use that. Dye it whatever color you want. Just make sure that you're using dye specifically for chocolate. Any old food gel will not work. It'll seize up your chocolate. Because I know I'm going to be putting this into a treat box, I used very, very short sticks so that they can fit in the closed box. I know I give some people anxiety by using such a shallow bowl, but it works if your cake pop is super, super stable. Make sure to whirl off all of that excess chocolate and then put some sprinkles on pretty quickly after, but you can have some hang time of about 10 to 15 seconds. If you put it on too quickly after, sometimes the chocolate and the sprinkles end up falling off completely. I'm using a texture which is called sanding sugar, and it's very, very fine. So it works really well with both cake pops and sugar cookie decorating because it doesn't drag any of those designs down and it doesn't drag the chocolate down. I do like to use chunkier sprinkles sometimes, but if you are a beginner cake pop maker, using the sanding sugar really, really is a game changer because it's so light that you're not going to have any issues with things falling off. I then put the cake pops into the fridge for about 10 to 15 minutes until the chocolate fully sets and is matte and is no longer shiny, and then I use this as an opportunity to shake off the excess sprinkles. I don't do this before because sometimes agitation can cause the chocolate to come off as well. I made these royal icing flowers to put both on my sugar cookies and the cake pops for this box. Originally, I was going to just adorn that mini cake with a bunch of these flowers on top with the vintage piping, but that didn't work out. However, these still looked really, really nice on all of the rest of the desserts. I didn't place these flowers directly on that melted chocolate because, again, the chocolate cannot withstand weight like this, and it would probably just end up dragging down and the placement would not be where I want it. So instead, I wait till the chocolate is fully dry, place a dot of royal icing on there. It is also a thickened texture, and then place that right on there. Notice there's no slipping or sliding of these flowers whatsoever because using the thickened royal icing really helps. If you don't want to use royal icing, you can adhere this with chocolate. It just takes a little bit longer because you will have to hold it there for just a few more seconds, whereas as you can see here, I don't have to hold these flowers on there at all. I had these really great visions of being able to package this so beautifully that nobody would be able to resist even looking at the box. But that didn't really happen because packaging is very, very expensive. It's also hard to get packaging just for 1 or 2 boxes unless you go to a cake supply store that sells them, and then you are very limited because there's only so many types of packaging within the local area, and I really didn't feel like ordering online because then I had to order several boxes. So although this may not be admittedly the most pretty packaging, it is very utilitarian, and I will say that it does the job and it all stays in place. And things staying in place and making sure that your product is not actually getting wrecked or damaged in any way is super, super important, especially because you're probably going to be handing off these boxes to people that aren't necessarily bakers. Because my smaller box only has 1 cupcake and I'm not actually using an insert, I did tape down my cupcake with just a little bit of clear tape that I rolled into an O and put down. This is what most of the bakeries I find do in my area. It's just the fastest way, and it really ensures that everything is going to stay in place. The other rule of thumb that I like to follow is making sure that things are tightly packed together. Not only does this not make the box look more visually appealing, it makes it so that nothing shifts. If you're wondering how to price a treat box like this, then I'm so glad you stuck it out till the end of the video. Let's start pricing these individual treats first, and then we will talk about the boxes themselves. Meringue batons are relatively cheap and easy to make. These would be $2 Canadian per meringue cookie. But I have seen them go for more in some local bakeries. Macarons usually cost around $2.75 each, but because these are specialized and you don't see these very often, I would charge $3.25 Canadian per macaron. The medium-sized cookie would be $5 each Canadian, and of course the giant cookie beside it would be $15 each. The average cupcake here goes for about $4 plus tax Canadian, so I would put these at around $5.50 to $6 per cupcake because they are a little bit more specialized. For a small treat box, I would charge $30 Canadian, and for this large one, I would charge $220 Canadian. This means that I'm charging for the items inside of the box, and I charged about $3 to $5 for a packaging fee. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading weekly, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. Bye!